Greetings, time traveler. While time quietly weaves its web in your world, here, in this moment we've captured, a cold night fog drifts lazily over a small village in the south of Brittany, deep in the 13th century. I'm merely an old historian, ready to whisper forgotten tales. If sleep gently reaches you, I'll be satisfied. But tell me, from which corner of the world have you come? And while you're here, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Stone chimneys breathe a damp, heavy scent of burning turf, blending with the sharp aroma of wet straw and fresh rye bread from the communal oven. It's a moment of forced retreat, where the long shadows of thatched houses seem to swallow the last traces of twilight. Feel the crisp air slipping beneath your cloak and let your mind drift into this forgotten place, where calm hides a heavy burden. The quiet of the village called Belvedere, ironically meaning beautiful view, is broken only by the metallic squeak of a well's wheel and the distant bleat of a lost sheep, a reminder of how fragile peasant life truly is. The single dirt road, hardened with frozen mud, reflects the heavy grey sky, painting the world in dull tones that mirror the mood of its humble people. Inside their homes, flickering firelight dances across rough walls, and families gather around the only source of warmth, whispering about the harvest that's gone and the taxes that will come. You can feel the depth of the silence surrounding this little settlement. It isn't the silence of peace, it's exhaustion, wrapped in quiet fear. Peasants with bent shoulders and hands scarred from endless labor carry the invisible weight of a distant kingdom ruled by a prince whose greed far outweighs his wisdom. Every drop of sweat from the barley fields and every piece of bread set aside is measured and taxed, as if even the villagers' breath belonged to the crown. Their lives might seem simple, but their submission is complex, woven with threads of subtle fear and silent resignation. At the small stone church on the village's edge, the monk Elouan lights the last of his tallow candles, spreading a pale glow across faded frescoes of saints and martyrs, a soft contrast to the harsh world outside. Elouan, a man of 40 with a long beard falling over his coarse wool habit, isn't a local. He's a traveler, a scribe seeking refuge and time to record what's happening across the realm. He's drawn to this place for its anonymity, a quiet corner that allows him to reflect on the great events shaking the Kingdom of England across the sea, events that, in a cruel and distant way, reach even this forgotten patch of land. The manuscripts in his leather satchel, heavy with the weight of unfolding history, are his only wealth and greatest burden. Elouan records every rumor, every royal edict, every increase in tax that reaches his ears through merchants and pilgrims passing through. He knows history isn't shaped only by kings and battles, but by the slow erosion of patience among ordinary people, reflected in the small stories of suffering he hears each night around the communal fire, where tears mix with the steam rising from the stew. His unease isn't personal. It's the ache of someone watching injustice take root like a parasite in the kingdom's body. King John, who inherited the crown after the disappearance of the legendary Richard the Lionheart, has imposed one of the harshest tax regimes ever seen, desperate to fund his ambitions and pay the debts left by his brother. Elouan remembers a curious fact. The tax called scutage, once meant to let knights pay money instead of serving in war, is now collected so often and at such absurd rates that even the most loyal barons find their coffers empty. The monk realizes this greed is planting seeds of rebellion. The memory of King Richard, wrapped in legends of bravery, hovers like a ghost over the crown and its people, a painful contrast to John's pettiness and volatile temper. While Richard was the image of a heroic crusader, John is a king obsessed with land and politics, a man who seems to have forgotten honor and loyalty. Sitting in the faint candlelight, Eluan runs his fingers over the parchment where he recorded the confiscation of lands and the selling of noble titles. He knows that John's lack of charisma and poor leadership, the very things that earned him the mocking name Lackland, are only the beginning of a much greater trouble. The monk rises, his wool habit brushing against the stone floor, and walks to the narrow window, staring into the damp darkness outside. He can smell rain approaching, a fresh, earthy scent that promises to clean the air, though not the souls of men. The silence of the night is only a mask. Underneath it, a conspiracy stirs, whispers of discontent spreading through castles and churches across England. Each day, more barons and bishops join the cause, not united by a charismatic leader, but by the simple urge to survive tyranny. He remembers the face of a nobleman who passed through the village last week, a man named Aubert, whose dignified, furious eyes showed he had reached his limit. Eluan heard that Aubert was one of the main organizers of a movement, one of the barons who had lost vast lands and was now determined to restore an ancient law or create a new one to restrain the king's power. Writing his name gave the monk a spark of hope. He knew that when individual courage multiplies into collective outrage, it becomes the most powerful force of the medieval world. The cold stone beneath his fingers reminds him of how fragile human life is and how strong human conviction can be. He imagines secret meetings lit by torches in the barons' fortresses, strong, silent men in heavy leather and iron, plotting the best way to oppose the crown. The contrast between peasant simplicity and noble intrigue is vast, yet connected by the same thread, the need for justice and safety. With every gathering, the list of demands grows, and their determination hardens. Eluan returns to his desk. The tip of his goosequill glides gently across parchment, the only sound breaking the church's solemn stillness. He writes the word tyranny and circles it, trying to understand a king who chooses fear instead of loyalty. He thinks of Eleanor, the wife of a local peasant whose small grain reserve was taken in the king's name. He knows the real story lives in these small tragedies, tiny pieces of pain that add up to a national wound. He also knows that the idea of a king being limited by written law is revolutionary. In the Middle Ages, royal power was believed to be a divine gift, almost absolute. But John's greed shattered that belief, forcing even conservative barons to question the very foundation of his rule. They weren't just fighting for land or money, they were fighting for a principle that the king must also be bound by rules. And once such an idea is born, it can never truly be erased. The monk stretches his back, the candle now burning low. The light falls across his hands in a dramatic glow. He remembers that monks like him are often the only ones who can read or write, entrusted with recording great documents, treaties and laws, silent guardians of memory. His quill isn't just a tool. It's a weapon against forgetting, a small lighthouse of clarity in a sea of confusion and violence. A faint smile touches his lips as he recalls a saying, "Kings rule, but scribes make them immortal." In his writings, he decides, King John will not be remembered only as a tyrant, but as the unwilling spark of a profound change. Beneath all the pain and hardship, history moves slowly towards something new, something the medieval world is forging in silence. And Eluan will be the witness of this birth. He writes another name, Geoffrey de Mandeville, one of the most influential nobles of the time, now a symbol of resistance. Impulsive and hungry for justice, Geoffrey has become a rallying point for barons tired of being treated like walking coin purses by their king. Their alliance, men from different lands with different interests, shows how deep the problem runs. By becoming everyone's enemy, the king has united his own opponents. As Eluan traces the letters of Geoffrey's name, he realizes the barons' power lies not in their armies, but in their ability to act together. King John, used to exploiting rivalries among his vassals, never expected a united front. The monk imagines the king's shock and fury as news of this organized resistance begins to spread, not a common riot, but a movement with clear demands grounded in law and fairness. The melted wax smells stronger now, and Eluan knows he should rest, yet the urge to keep writing is irresistible. He adds a final line for the night, describing how the barons plan to force the king to meet them, not on a battlefield, but at a negotiation table, in a duel of wills where parchment becomes the only weapon. The idea fascinates him, the written word holding more power than the sword. Cold air crawls from the church walls, but he feels warmed by the fire of the story growing in his mind. The beauty of the Middle Ages, he thinks, lies in this contrast. The cruelty of kings and the resilience of ordinary people, the harshness of the law and the eternal pursuit of justice. And this brewing confrontation between the king and his barons will become one of the greatest turning points in history. The candle flame trembles, throwing a large distorted shadow across the wall, like the profile of an angry king, or perhaps a warrior in armor. Eluan closes the inkwell with a firm, metallic click. Darkness takes over, but his mind stays bright, focused on King John, the villain of a story that would ironically give birth to freedom. He looks at his manuscript, resting on the table, ready to receive the next chapters of this saga. He can almost hear swords clashing, negotiations rising in tense voices, and the scratching of a quill, soon to write the clauses of a document that will change the world. The air is thick with anticipation, a silent calm before the storm. And as sleep calls you too, traveler, your mind is free to slip into the heart of this conspiracy. Close your eyes and breathe the medieval air. Let the scent of turf and parchment lull you. Picture King John alone in his castle, plotting new taxes, unaware that his reign is about to become the stage of a quiet revolution, one where power will shift from the sword to the seal. The night in Belvedere embraces you, promising a dawn in the middle of the storm. You are invited to dream of the birth of justice, to feel the fear and hope of a time when men dared to stand against a king. The fog over Belvedere thickens, and after a restless, brief rest, the monk Eluan rises again, drawn by the urgency to record the conflict's steady climb. He now turns his focus to King John, whose erratic behavior wasn't just a moral failing, but a political blunder that ate away at the foundations of his own rule. The king had lost not only his continental lands, hence Lackland, but also his people's trust, picking endless fights with the church and squeezing money from every layer of society. His disdain for old laws and customs was the spark that lit the nobility's fury. As the night deepens, Eluan takes up his quill to mark the importance of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Appointed by Pope Innocent III in the midst of a fierce dispute with John, Langton wasn't merely a churchman. He was a legal scholar and a shrewd peacemaker who stood with the barons, giving them the moral and legal grounds for resistance. A cleric of his stature lent the baronial cause a legitimacy that a simple feudal revolt could never claim, turning it into a struggle for principles, of justice and of faith. The monk reflects on a familiar pattern in history. Great political changes are often driven by money. John's unbearable taxes, raised to fund his campaigns in France and to pay foreign mercenaries, proved to be the last straw. He crossed a line even his most heavy-handed predecessors had not, levying taxes without the consent of the realm's great councils. That overreach bound together knights, bishops, and even citizens from rising cities like London. He pictures it clearly, barons gathering in secret with the noble Aubert and Geoffrey de Mandeville at their head, swearing to stand together until the king yielded. Their aim wasn't to depose John, that would be treason, but to limit him with a formal instrument, a charter. Eluan writes about the idea of ancient liberties, a phrase the barons used for the rights and privileges they believed earlier kings had granted, and John, in his overreach, had brushed aside, making him a usurper of his own royal legacy. The lingering incense in the church reminds him of the era's religious dimension and how the conflict played out. The Pope's excommunication of John, a deep humiliation for a medieval monarch, further weakened the king's hand, handing the barons a kind of moral, almost sacred license to oppose him. Fear of a French invasion, a constant, real threat, combined with eroding support at home, created the perfect pressure to force John to meet. Eluan listens to the wind slipping through the church's cracks, a cold whisper carrying news from miles away, where king and barons prepared to face each other. He knows the choice of meeting place would matter. An open field, not a fortress, would signal negotiation rather than war, though banners and blades would still speak quietly of power. He notes the symbolic choice, a meadow called Runnymede, an old, melancholy name on the banks of the River Thames. This damp, often desolate plain was historically neutral, and conveniently set between the royal stronghold at Windsor and the barons' camp at Staines, simple for both sides to reach and to secure. Nature, with its austere beauty, would stand as the only impartial witness to that decisive moment, where the law of men would challenge the will of a king. The monk describes the taut air over Runnymede in those June days of 1215. The barons, armour glinting in the sun, yet worn down by the long march and the weight, watched the royal camp with wary eyes. On the king's side, the show was smaller but more ostentatious, the wounded pride of a monarch forced to bend. Few kings had ever been made to seal a written agreement. John's submission would set a rare and dangerous precedent. He can almost smell the mix of leather, sweat and steel from the armour, laced with the fresh scent of wet grass. John, short in stature and hot-tempered by nature, likely arrived seething, masking his anger with a practiced calm. Eluan senses the king's real intention. Buy time, promise anything to scatter the barons for now, and then, at the earliest chance, beg the Pope to void the charter. Eluan's quill sketches Stephen Langton as the quiet mediator, the true architect of the text to come. Langton and his advisers had shaped the barons' messy, vengeful list of demands into a coherent set of articles rooted in feudal law and older letters of liberty. The archbishop's finesse lay in presenting the proposals as a restoration of ancient rights, not the creation of brand-new chains for royal power. The document's name takes form under his pen, Magna Carta Libertatum, the Great Charter of Liberties. Eluan notes its elegant dual nature, born as a feudal settlement meant to end a quarrel between the king and some 40 specific barons, yet carrying universal principles that reached far beyond time and place. It aided not only nobles, but also the church, merchants and free men, a foundation future generations would stand on to make fresh claims. He recalls a lesser-known detail. The original Magna Carta wasn't a single copy. Several were made and sealed, dispatched to dioceses throughout the realm, to be read aloud so that even those who didn't grasp its legal language would still know the king had accepted limits. Multiplying the text acted as both safeguard and message, making the written word unmistakably stronger than a monarch's will. His focus shifts to the feel of parchment, dear and scarce, scraped from animal skin, made to last. That rolled skin, soon to be sealed by John, would carry centuries on its back, Black ink brewed from soot and gum would keep its clauses legible, fixing in time the idea that the king stood under the law and that justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. When King John set the royal seal, rather than signing by hand, which was less common for such instruments, he did so under duress, yet the act still bound him in law. Elouan imagines the heavy stamp of wax pressing into parchment, a muffled sound that would echo across the ages, the crack of law rising over tyranny. John might not have meant to obey, but the seal trapped him in his own word. The story, of course, didn't end in peace. John quickly sent messengers to the Pope asking that the charter be annulled, and the Pope, seeing it as an insult to royal authority, complied. England slid back into civil war. Still, the seed of limited kingship had been planted, and even cancelled, the charter had already become a symbol. Dawn's chill sharpens, and Elouan feels it's time to pause. He records the king's flight after the annulment, the war that followed, and John's sudden early death the next year, 1216, perhaps from dysentery or sheer exhaustion. Ironically, that death saved the charter from vanishing altogether. He adds how John's young son, Henry III, was crowned in haste, and how his regents, desperate to win back the barons and steady the realm, reissued Magna Carta in a slightly revised form. A charter born from a king's greed and his subjects' hatred found its survival in another ruler's need for peace, becoming, in truth, the law of the land. Elouan stops and breathes deeply, relieved to have pinned down the heart of that quiet revolution. The candle gutters and dies, and the church's darkness gathers him in. This isn't a darkness for fear, but for contemplation, a reminder that even in the bleakest times, under the heaviest yoke, courage and principle can give birth to the greatest charters of freedom. Let the image of Runnymede settle in your mind. The damp wind moving over the grass, the parchment still fresh with wax and ink on a small wooden table, the future of law written between its lines. Rest with that picture, traveller, knowing that the sound of a royal seal can, at times, be the overture to freedom. With the soft morning light beginning to slip through the church's narrow windows, the monk Elouan turns his attention to the lives the Magna Carta promised to protect. He chooses to focus on the central image of this new chapter, the Abbey of Saint-Firmin, a Cistercian monastery, an entirely original name, standing on the banks of the River Ouse in England, a place of learning and spiritual refuge. This setting, rich with sounds and scents, becomes the starting point for reflecting on how law would touch ordinary days. Round the Abbey of Saint-Firmin, the morning air carries the slow, rhythmic sound of bells, calling the monks to the first hour of prayer, a deep, lingering tone that drifts across the river fog and fills the world with unshakable calm. Elouan, imagining and narrating this distant scene, senses the sweet, earthy smell of dew settled on the monastery gardens, mixed with the drier odour of parchment and the wax of candles burning endlessly on the altars. The cold stone beneath the monk's bare feet is a quiet penance, a reminder of the body's fragility beside the eternity of faith. The abbey, with its silent cloisters and pale limestone walls, is a small reflection of the whole kingdom. Here lives Brother Eustace, the cellarer, a 60-year-old monk of Franco-Norman origin, his wrinkled face shaped by contemplation and endless patience. He's responsible for negotiating the abbey's supplies at nearby fairs. He is the silent link between cloistered life and the outside world, and his main worry is the instability brought on by the civil war that followed King John's death. Merchants, afraid of confiscation and raids, hesitate to travel, and the price of salt, essential for preserving food, has risen sharply. Brother Eustace pays close attention to the Magna Carta clauses that protect merchants, granting them the freedom to travel without abusive tolls or customs fees. Eluan notes an important and slightly curious historical point. Growing towns and merchants actively supported the charter because it promised standard weights and measures and fair trade, except during wartime. A considerable advance for a feudal economy long ruled by local whims and arbitrary taxes. Yet even under the Church's protection, the Abbey of Saint-Firmin isn't free from fear. Rumors say mercenaries, those same soldiers King John once hired, still wander the roads like bandits, and the community lives in constant vigilance. Food, safety, and the ability to feed the poor, one of the Cistercian order's sacred duties, are all uncertain. For them, Magna Carta isn't a distant political document, but a concrete promise that law will restore order to military chaos. Eluan imagines Eustace walking through the cloisters, the sound of his leather sandals tapping gently against polished stone, a slow heartbeat marking monastery time. Eustace reflects on the quiet irony. A law forced upon a tyrant king has become the best hope that peasants and monks might enjoy a somewhat predictable life. The mystery surrounding him is one of faith and order surviving inside a world of disorder. In the Abbey Library, a tall, cool hall smelling of mould and ancient leather, a young novice named Theodore, just 18, runs his fingers along bound volumes, copying and illuminating manuscripts under the dim light from stained glass windows. Pale-skinned and quick-fingered, Theodore loves the art of writing and is learning to draw richly decorated capital letters, the rubrics. His current task is to copy a treatise on the authority of kings, and he feels the weight of contradiction between divine theory and earthly reality. The young novice is quietly troubled. The words he copies praise absolute royal power, yet the stories whispering through the abbey speak of a king who ignored every rule. The contrast between the glorified king on parchment and the cruel king of the real world leaves him with a gentle confusion. If a king is anointed by God, how can human law stand above his will? His serenity wavers as he searches for an answer. The Abbey of Saint-Firmin owns an intricate system of watermills, essential for grinding wheat and barley. They are the beating heart of the monastery's economy, and Eluan records that, in history, possession of mills was a great feudal privilege. The constant splash of water striking the wheel and the slow grind of stone-crushing grain are the sounds of prosperity and self-sufficiency. The Magna Carta also protected towns and barons from unjust royal taxes on milling, showing how deeply the charter was rooted in everyday economic life. The abbot, Father Allard, a pragmatic older man with a low, worn voice shaped by age and chanting, is especially grateful for the clause guaranteeing the Church's freedom, forbidding the king from meddling in elections of bishops and abbots. To Allard, this point matters above all others because it preserves the monastery's autonomy and its ability to act as a moral and economic power, free of the royal treasury's pressure. Eluan focuses on the abbey's climate, cold and damp at dawn, yet a sanctuary from the unstable roads and war-torn castles. Safety here is a rare luxury, protected by monastic rule and the respect the Church still commands. He imagines the drifting scent of incense, sandalwood and myrrh, floating during liturgy, purifying the air and quieting the spirit. As Theodore paints a gold-leaf letter J for the king's name, he feels the soft touch of a squirrel hairbrush in his hand. He decides to give the letter a sad, ironic expression, adding tiny details hinting at the monarch's greed, his own tiny rebellion. It's his way of taking part in the great drama unfolding across the kingdom, using art to voice a silent criticism. The Magna Carta also held the famous Clause 39, stating that no free man would be imprisoned, exiled, or harmed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Eluan recognizes the historic weight of that sentence. the seed of habeas corpus and due process, a promise that justice would no longer be arbitrary but grounded in law. When Brother Eustace steps out to oversee the kitchen, he meets Elouan and tells him the story of a peasant on Abbey lands, Gautier, whose cart of hay was stolen by mercenaries. Gautier's pain is everyone's pain. The law must protect the small as well as the great. This tiny human story slips into the larger tapestry. Law is only real when it reaches daily life. Elouan notes the clause protecting peasants' property from seizure, except for royal needs, and with immediate fair payment. The barons, while safeguarding their estates, had to extend the same shield to free men, a category that included wealthier peasants and craftsmen. It is one of history's gentle ironies, self-interest giving birth to public good. The monk listens to the soft patter of rain outside, beating rhythmically on the abbey's slate roof, a sound that soothes and isolates. The monastery becomes a refuge not only of stone, but of morality, where divine order survives while the world falls apart. Theodore closes the scriptorium window, breathing in the smell of wet earth, and the abbey sinks into deep serenity. Father Allard teaches Theodore that the word law, lex in Latin, comes from a verb meaning to bind. It reminds him that law exists not to oppress, but to unite and to limit, keeping society woven together. The abbot believes that despite its flaws and feudal interests, the Magna Carta is a step toward such unity, a document that binds the king to his people in a way never seen before. At the end of the day, Theodore covers his parchment with a piece of linen to protect it from the damp. He feels the roughness of the page beneath his fingertips, realizing that a manuscript's greatest strength isn't its colored ink, but the truth it holds. His gentle curiosity about power becomes a quiet acceptance of government's complexity. Elouan closes his description of the abbey, understanding that the monastery, with its discipline and order, is a reflection of what the kingdom should be. The steady murmur of the river Ouse flows like a natural counterpoint to the world's political turmoil. The subtle contrast between Brother Eustace's simple life and the complexity of Magna Carta's clauses reminds him that history operates on many scales, and that the right to justice touches everyone, from the cellarer to the noble. As the morning sun advances across the courtyard of the Abbey of Saint-Firmin, Brother Elouan takes up his quill again to deepen his description of the Magna Carta's impact on social order and the growing sense of justice. He reflects on a revolutionary idea for the medieval world, that law, instead of serving as a tool of royal oppression, could become a shield. The warmth of the rising sun brushing the monastery's cold stone brings a faint comfort, softening his thoughts about the harshness of the age. Brother Eustace, the cellarer, is already on his morning journey to the nearby village. The sound of his steady footsteps along the damp dirt path blends with the clear, melodic song of birds, the gentle music of a quiet countryside. He carries not only a purse of coins for supplies, but a quiet hope that peace and stability promised by the new charter will at last become real. Eustace, with a lifetime of experience, knows a king's word can change with the wind. But a sealed document supported by a coalition of nobles has a different kind of weight. Elouan notes that the fear of having one's property seized was a constant shadow in a peasant's life, and the Magna Carta tried to address this. One clause forbade the confiscation of a free man's horses or carts, except under strict circumstances and with payment. A small but important curiosity. The law reached into the smallest details of daily life, ensuring the peasant could work and survive. The absence of arbitrary seizure meant the difference between survival and misery. He imagines the village market, a loud, bustling place where the sharp smell of manure mixes with the tempting scent of rare spices carried by Italian merchants. Voices rise and fall as sellers shout prices, and the steady clink of weights on metal scales fills the air. It's in this lively chaos that the rule of law must stand firm. The Magna Carta promised that merchants could trade under fair conditions, without random tolls and fees demanded by every passing lord. Back in the scriptorium, young Theodore continues his work, now copying letters the abbot will send to other monasteries, warning them about the political situation and urging them to defend the charter's terms. The slow, deliberate movement of the quill against parchment feels heavy with responsibility. Theodore is helping sustain the fragile network of communication that held medieval society together. Abbot Allard teaches him about the difference between divine law and secular law. The Magna Carta doesn't challenge God's authority over the king, he explains, only the king's authority over earthly law. It's a gentle exercise in political theology. A king may be anointed, but he is not above the community of his peers. Theodore finds peace in this subtle realization, sensing that faith and earthly justice can coexist in a productive tension. Eluan reflects on the deep contrast between the reigns of King John and his brother, Richard the Lionheart. Richard, always abroad, demanded enormous taxes for crusades and ransoms, but was admired for his courage. John, by staying home, became a fiscal tyrant. The monk sees a painful truth: distant glory is easier to forgive than present oppression. And it was this everyday oppression, not foreign wars, that sparked the Baron's rebellion. He also remembers a legal custom once common in Europe: trial by ordeal, where guilt was tested by hot iron or deep water. But that old world was fading. The Magna Carta supported a new idea: judgment by oath and by peers. Clause 39, with its promise of lawful judgment, marked a slow but inevitable turn away from superstition and toward reason. The village market, warmer and more crowded than the cloister, feels stifling to Brother Eustace, but he stays calm. He bargains patiently for a sack of flour, knowing every coin saved matters. His quiet prudence is a medieval virtue, steadiness in the face of uncertainty. Eluan reflects that if the Magna Carta had vanished, the history of law would look very different. Even though the charter was revoked and rewritten many times, it persisted as a precedent, a physical reminder that united subjects could place limits on the king. That is the gentle truth he wants to record, the resilience of an idea. Another detail catches his mind: the requirement that the king consult the Common Council of the realm, an early ancestor of Parliament, before raising most taxes. This was the most radical clause of all, and later versions softened it to satisfy the Pope. Yet the seed was planted. The principle that taxation without representation is unlawful was born here, on a quiet meadow at Runnymede, long before the world gave that idea a name. By the time Theodore finishes copying his letters, he grants himself a small pause. He looks out toward the River Ouse, flowing steadily beside the abbey. The water reminds him of history itself, constant fluid, always moving. Law, though written on parchment, must also be reinterpreted to stay alive. His reflection is a quiet, poetic metaphor for continuity. Eluan adds another gentle conclusion. King John's legacy, through ironic fate, was freedom. His cruelty forced the creation of its antidote: law above the king. The tyrant became an unwilling father of the rule of law and the roots of democracy. It is the lesson Eluan wishes to preserve. He returns to the image of Aubert and Mandeville, the barons, standing firm in their armor on the damp meadow, their banners snapping in the wind, their swords sheathed but ready, the silent posture of men willing to fight for a principle. To Eluan, there is no nobler form of revolt. The last picture he paints is of Gautier's peasant family, now protected by written clause and sealed promise. Their cart will not be taken from them. The law has entered their humble world. Eluan feels that recording these small victories is as important as chronicling the Baron's triumphs. The smell of fresh ink rises from his parchment, a scent he associates with truth and permanence. His calm isn't just the abbey's stillness, but the quiet satisfaction of a historian who has watched chaos give birth to order. He closes the inkwell with a soft, contented click. For now, the serenity of dawn at the Abbey of Saint-Firmin and the victory of law over the king's arbitrary will offers a peaceful invitation to rest. Turning now to the essence of law and its transmission, Brother Eluan shifts his reflection back to the physical object itself, the parchment of the Magna Carta and the act of copying and preserving it. From his quiet corner in Belvedere, he imagines the city of London, a place of noise, trade, and restless energy, as the stage where the Charter would be read and debated. In his mind, he can almost smell new vellum and warm beeswax carried on London's heavier, smokier air. London, with its grey walls and the constant rumble of its docks, was home to Athelstan, a 50-year-old master scribe with ink-stained fingers and an enviable hand. He lived and worked on Fleet Street, close to the courts. Athelstan was one of many scribes quickly hired by the barons and the church to prepare official copies of the Magna Carta in the weeks after its sealing at Runnymede. For him, law was not an idea. It was hours of precise, exhausting labor. His writing desk, set beneath a tall window for the best daylight, was crowded with finely prepared rolls of parchment waiting to bear the weight of those words. The vellum beneath his hand felt smooth and slightly oily as he sharpened his goosequill with patient care. The main sound in his chamber was the slow, steady scratch of the pen against skin, a soft, hypnotic rhythm that embodied the survival of law. The master scribe often marveled at the irony. The most urgent work of his life was copying rules that restrained a king. He lingered over Clause 28, which forbade royal officers from taking a man's grain or goods without immediate payment, unless he willingly agreed to wait. Eluan notes this as a quiet curiosity that reveals the document's practical soul. The protection of ordinary property against sheriffs and minor royal agents who once seized at will. As Athelstan copied the famous Clause 39, promising lawful judgment of his peers, a wave of hope moved through him. He knew that these words were a great leap forward from King John's arbitrary courts, where enemies were often condemned without any fair process. His work was no longer mechanical. He was spreading the idea of liberty. Eluan dives deeper into the materials. The black ink, made from gallnut tannin and iron salts, was astonishingly durable, ensuring that the Charter's text would survive the centuries. The red ink, used for decorated initials, was more delicate and prone to fading. Even the color of ink was an investment in the permanence of law. Yet Athelstan worked under a silent threat. If King John managed to overturn the Charter and arrest the rebelling barons, the scribes who copied it might also face punishment. The contrast between his calm concentration and the turbulent world outside formed a quiet tension. Still, he held to his routine, shaping each letter with perfect care, as if flawless handwriting might bring order to the chaos. He imagined the Great Seal being pressed onto each finished copy, a heavy disc of red beeswax attached to the parchment by silk cords. The seal was the true mark of authority. Eluan notes that sealing, rather than signing, was the legal validation of royal documents, and that John's seal became his unwilling signature in history. Athelstan paused for a moment to look out the window. The clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets and the smell of fried fish drifting from nearby taverns reminded him of the ordinary lives the Charter was meant to protect. He saw a wool farmer from Kent come to sell his goods at market, and remembered a clause limiting excessive fines so that punishment would not ruin a man entirely. Elouan records that the Magna Carta was, in truth, a living document. After John's death and the coronation of his young son Henry III in 1216, the Charter was issued again in 1216, 1217, and finally 1225, each time with adjustments to fit political realities. The 1225 version became the permanent law. The Charter was not an ending, but a long negotiation. Now Athelstan copied Clause 61, the most radical of all, which allowed 25 barons to gather and coerce and harass the king if he broke his promises. He felt the force of that idea, the first formal step toward limited monarchy in the Western world. The thought that a king could be legally restrained by his subjects was the quiet climax of the parchment. Elouan emphasizes the urgency of the work. Hundreds of copies needed to be produced and sent to dioceses and counties so the law could be known and enforced. Athelstan and other scribes labored day and night, driven by the awareness that they were writing the future of English law. The master scribe rubbed the ache in his wrist, the physical touch of exhaustion, but balanced it with the satisfaction of precision. The handwriting had to be flawless, with no blots or scratches, for a mistake could alter the meaning of the law. Accuracy was his form of loyalty. When Athelstan finished copying a clause protecting the church, he glanced at the page and saw the subtle beauty of contrast, the sober black of the text, the vivid red of the initials. Law, he realized, was a blend: seriousness in black, passion, and importance in red. Elouan concludes that the true strength of the Magna Carta didn't lie on John's battlefields, but in quiet rooms like Athelstan's, where the pen proved stronger than the sword. And so the soft scratch of the quill in London and the scent of fresh parchment become the final invitation to your imagination, traveller. The picture of Athelstan, master scribe, copying freedom word by word, ensuring that the legacy of a tyrant became the foundation of law. The steady hum of London, softened by the tall window of Athelstan's scriptorium, becomes a constant backdrop to his labour. He now turns his attention to the precise legal language of the Magna Carta. Although written in medieval Latin, the formal language of law and the church, it was filled with complex legal terms understood only by lawyers, monks, and scribes. To Brother Elouan, reflecting from Belvedere, this reliance on a literate elite was a mirror of medieval society itself, where knowledge was a form of power. Athelstan is copying a clause about relief, the payment an heir owed the king to take possession of his feudal inheritance. The Magna Carta strictly limited how much the king could demand, a point that had caused bitter conflict between John and the barons. The scribe uses a bone ruler to ensure each line lies perfectly straight. The cold, smooth touch of the bone, a quiet reminder of his precision. His accuracy is a form of passive resistance against arbitrary rule. Brother Elouan notes a curious detail. The Latin of the Magna Carta was already archaic at the time, and copies had to be translated into French, the language of the Norman court and nobility, and eventually into English so common people could hear and understand it. The need for constant translation was proof of its growing importance, and of its slow transformation from a feudal contract into a public statute. As Athelstan works, he thinks of his son Giles, an apprentice dyer who, like most people, would never read the original parchment. Yet Giles would still benefit from Clause 13, which ensured that London and all other towns and boroughs would keep their ancient liberties and customs. This protection was essential for trade and urban growth, allowing cities to function independently of royal interference. Later in the afternoon, Athelstan lights a bit of incense, pine resin and rosemary, to perfume the room and keep insects away from the vellum. The warm scent is a sensory reminder of preservation. The document must survive to be read by future generations. In this moment, he feels less like a writer and more like a silent guardian of the Charter. Now he moves to the final stage of his work, serene contemplation. His eyes travel carefully down the long lines of script, searching for errors. The silence of the room is so deep it almost roars, broken only by the soft crackle of embers in a small copper brazier. He knows that beauty in law comes from clarity, and that justice can only exist if the text is flawless. Brother Eluan records that although the original Magna Carta was revoked by the Pope, it was soon reissued by the Regency Council of the young King Henry III and sent to every county with a promise of peace. The law became a tool of reconciliation and legitimacy for the new reign, proof that John's tyranny had forced the kingdom to accept a different path. Eluan imagines Athelstan cleaning his quills and inkwell, slow, deliberate motions of a man who has just finished a monumental task. The smooth grain of the wooden desk under his hands brings comfort, a sign that for a brief moment the world's chaos has been contained by the order of his craft. He feels the gentle relief of having set those words into permanence. Athelstan stands, stretches, and feels the stiffness of long hours. He looks at the pile of sealed copies waiting to be sent. The rumble of wagons in the street below becomes the sound of the law being delivered, the promise of justice carried across the kingdom by riders and messengers. Brother Eluan ends his account with a quiet realization. The Magna Carta is proof that hope can rise from oppression. It is the material form of a resistance that was not only military but intellectual, sustained by the silent dedication of men like Stephen Langton and Athelstan, the master scribe. Back in Belvedere, Eluan feels the cold, damp air outside his church window. The thought of the Magna Carta gives him deep serenity. History may be scarred by violence, but it moves slowly, stubbornly toward justice, guided by the written word and by the courage of free men. He imagines Athelstan closing the heavy wooden door of his London scriptorium, sealing himself away from the street's noise. Inside, the parchment with its dark letters rests safely, guarding the promise of liberty for the realm. The law is safe, and now, at last, it is time to rest. Late afternoon in Rye brings a low, golden light that stretches across the wool market, catching the coarse textures of the bales and the dark tones of the merchants' clothing. Brother Eluan continues his quiet meditation on the impact of law, focusing now on medieval customs and how the Charter wove itself into the fabric of daily life, altering habits of power. The air grows colder, and the smell of the sea grows stronger, signaling high tide and the arrival of night. William the merchant walks down the narrow street that leads to the harbour, and the sound of his leather boots on the stone pavement becomes sharper in the silence that settles before the market closes. He joins a small crowd of citizens and traders standing around a wooden notice nailed to a wall, a newly issued bylaw. The right of towns to make their own local laws and to have their liberties preserved was a direct gain from the Magna Carta, Clause 13. Brother Eluan notes an interesting medieval custom. Since most people were illiterate, edicts and laws were read aloud in public places, churches, marketplaces, and taverns, and when posted were often decorated with simple illustrations to help everyone understand. Though the Charter was written in Latin, it was read and retold in French and English, becoming part of the kingdom's legal folklore. Lady Isolde, a noble supporter of the Charter, joins the group and shares a story she heard in London, the importance of Clause 17, which fixed the Court of Common Pleas in a permanent location. Previously, King John had carried his court with him, forcing people to travel long and dangerous distances to seek justice. Establishing the court at Westminster was a tremendous improvement, making justice more accessible and far less expensive for ordinary people. The perspective now shifts to Gervase, an old sailor with skin weathered by sun and salt, who listens carefully as the new bylaw is read aloud. For Gervase, the greatest victory is not about taxes, but about finally having the right to be heard. He feels the rough rope in his hands, his trade, his life, and realizes that his work is now protected by something greater than the whim of a local lord. Brother Elouan reflects on the contrast between feudal life, built on personal bonds of loyalty, and the rise of a society built on rules, written rights, and a king bound by his own seal. The Magna Carta was the first great document to institutionalize this shift, transforming the relationship between monarch and subject from a personal bond into a contractual one. He records that Clause 41 was crucial for port towns like Rye. It guaranteed the free entry and departure of foreign merchants for safe trade, unless their nation was at war with England. This legal protection of international commerce was vital for the economy, showing that the Charter reached far beyond the narrow concerns of feudal barons. William the Merchant and Lady Isolde exchange a quiet look. They know the law is imperfect and that King Henry III continues to search for ways around it, but the document exists, and it has been confirmed again. The parchment, with its written rights, has become the moral compass of the realm, an unmovable point of reference in every future argument. Far away in Belvedere, Brother Elouan smells peat smoke in the evening air. It feels lighter now. He realizes that the strength of the Magna Carta lies in its transformation into an operational myth, a founding story retold through generations, reinforcing the idea that power must be limited. The sun disappears completely over the English Channel, and the market in Rye empties, leaving behind the smell of salt and wool. The final image is the wooden notice on the wall, lit by a torch that has just been lit, the written law remaining visible, guarding the town as it sleeps. This is the serenity of a people who for a moment have placed the law above the king. A quiet habit had begun to form, revealing the slow shift in mentality brought about by the Magna Carta. Brother Elouan, reflecting in distant Belvedere, now imagines himself in the home of a goldsmith in the city of Bristol, a major commercial and manufacturing centre of the 13th century, around the year 1250. Here the focus turns to the purity of metal, symbolizing the purity and standardization of law. The atmosphere in Gilbert's workshop, a thin, meticulous man of 40, wearing small, metal-rimmed spectacles at the end of his nose, is shaped by the gentle, repeated tap of a small hammer striking a steel anvil. The air smells sharply of burning coal and the almost sweet, metallic scent of gold and silver being worked. Heat radiates from the small forge, creating a warm pocket in the otherwise cool room. Gilbert inspects a small silver coin he has just struck, holding it beneath a magnifying lens to check the perfection of its emblem. His work demands absolute precision, and he is always mindful of Clause 35 of the Magna Carta, which guaranteed 1 measure for wine, 1 measure for ale, and 1 measure for corn, and 1 width for cloth, and the same shall be done with weights and measures. Brother Elouan records this authentic historical detail. The standardization of weights and measures was one of the greatest practical benefits of the Charter for merchants. King John and many nobles used local fraudulent measures to cheat traders and enrich themselves. The demand for a national standard, protected by the crown, became the foundation of fair and honest commerce. Gilbert remembers his grandfather's stories of how, in King John's day, the uncertainty of weights forced him to pay bribes in every town, lest his goods be seized under the accusation of royal fraud. The fear of a false scale was real. Now, Gilbert feels the cool, smooth touch of the balance he uses, stamped with the royal seal, guaranteeing its legitimacy. The gesture in focus is Gilbert's obsessive attention to the purity of the gold he uses to craft rings and jewelry for the region's nobles. He measures the alloy with a precision that borders on devotion. The goldsmith sees the metaphor clearly. For law to be effective, it must be as pure and consistent as the gold he melts and shapes. A law adulterated with royal greed loses its value and its trust. For the people of Bristol, whose lives revolved around trade and craftsmanship, the Magna Carta was not about the rights of barons, but about the security of their business. The promise that agreements would be honored and that they would not be extorted by excessive tolls was the foundation of their prosperity and of their loyalty to the crown. Gilbert is repairing an old silver chalice owned by a local knight, a man who fought against King John in 1215. As he polishes the tarnished metal, the soft whisper of wool against silver fills the workshop. The shine returning to the cup becomes a symbol of the honor and justice the knight fought to restore through the charter. Gilbert also keeps Clause 38 in mind, which forbade an officer from bringing any man to trial upon his simple word without credible witnesses. Deio, although originally intended for nobles, this principle was beginning to influence the city courts, forcing judges to demand evidence rather than accept mere accusation. Slowly, rationality was replacing arbitrariness. Brother Elouan notes the sharp smell of vinegar, which Gilbert uses to clean impurities from the metal. It is a natural metaphor. The law, too, must be used to clean the kingdom of corruption. The cleansing of silver and the cleansing of the political body are parallel acts. The goldsmith remembers his father's habit of hiding a small portion of silver under the floorboards, afraid of royal officers. This fearful behavior was common in John's reign. Now, Gilbert keeps his metal in a locked compartment in the wall, trusting that the law will protect it, a subtle but profound shift in his sense of belonging and safety. He focuses again on the gesture of testing the hardness of gold, feeling the tool press against the metal. He knows that the hardness of law, its refusal to bend to tyranny, is what gives it value and endurance. In a quiet way, he forges trust in the law with every object he creates. Brother Elouan records that, although Kings Henry III and later Edward the Fine tried to revoke or ignore the Magna Carta, pressure from Parliament, growing stronger each year, and the determination of merchants forced its reconfirmation more than 30 times throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. It was this repetition that made the charter permanent. Gilbert picks up a small nugget of pure gold, feeling its dense weight in his palm. He knows this weight is the weight of truth, of standardization, of trust. He smiles, softly, serenely, because his work, his craft, and his livelihood are now protected by a piece of parchment he has never read, but in which he believes completely. His intimate gaze falls on the polished metal, reflecting the light of the forge. The law, he thinks, must be as pure and as reflective as the finest gold. Goldsmith Gilbert continues his work in his Bristol workshop, and the warmth from the forge, even if confined to one corner, creates a pleasant feeling as the day advances. He turns now to the quiet habit of carefully calibrating his scales, using small bronze weights he forged himself, ensuring that the precision of his work is unquestionable. This gesture is an act of faith in Clause 35, which promised the standardization of weights and measures throughout the kingdom, an ideal he strives to uphold within his own small sphere of influence. Brother Elouan, still reflecting from distant Belvedere, records an authentic historical curiosity. Medieval goldsmiths and jewelers often acted as bankers and appraisers of precious metals. They were therefore essential figures in the economy. Their integrity and the purity of the metal they certified were the foundation of commercial trust, and the Magna Carta provided the legal framework for that trust by requiring uniform weights and measures. Gilbert receives a visit from Mathieu, a young apprentice baker, who has come to weigh a delivery of flour for his master. With patience, the goldsmith uses his large scale to certify the amount, and the soft hiss of coarse flour being poured into the pan is the sound of everyday life. Gilbert explains to Mathieu that the king's law requires everyone to use the same measures so that no one is cheated. He feels the texture of the flour, light and dry, a contrast to the dense weight of the gold he handles each day. He realizes that the law, like commerce, must touch both the bread of the peasant and the ring of the noble. Clause 35 mentioned corn explicitly, showing that the lawmakers were concerned with the basic economy, not only feudal luxuries. Brother Elouan reflects on the subtle contrast between human fragility and the permanence of law. King John and the barons have been gone for decades, yet the principle of standardized weights and measures, written on that parchment, continues to benefit later generations, Mathieu the baker, Gilbert the goldsmith. It guarantees a quiet sense of confidence in their daily transactions. Gilbert wipes the scale clean, and the smell of vinegar and oil hangs in the air. He remembers a small human story his father told him. In John's time, a local baker had been forced to pay an enormous fine because a royal officer claimed his bushel of flour was unfairly light. The goldsmith understands that true freedom is the freedom to work without constant fear of official extortion. His gesture of placing each tool back in its place is an act of order. The hammer, the tongs, the magnifying lens, each one has a defined purpose and rests exactly where it belongs. He sees in that order a reflection of the law itself. Every clause of the Magna Carta has its place and its purpose, working together to form a structure of justice. Brother Elouan notes that the scent of the forge, the heat and the smell of metal, becomes a symbol of purification. The fire of law burns away corruption and arbitrariness, leaving behind only the pure essence of justice. When Gilbert purifies gold, he performs a small parallel to the work of the lawmakers who once sought to purify the kingdom. Gilbert finishes repairing the knight's silver chalice, and the metal catches the late afternoon light. He feels a deep sense of belonging to the community of Bristol, knowing that his craft and the quality of his work help uphold the city's reputation, a reputation now protected by the freedoms guaranteed in the Charter. His eyes return to the scale, now balanced and empty. The balance, an ancient symbol of justice, rests quietly, yet ready. It ensures that the promise of one measure and one weight will continue to be honored, forging trust throughout the kingdom. Linking the goldsmith's individual experience of law to its collective force in church and state, Brother Elouan, still imagining from distant Belvedere, now places himself in a great abbey in Yorkshire, in the north of England, around the year 1270. It's a time when the Magna Carta was fiercely challenged and repeatedly reconfirmed under King Edward the Stir. The Abbey of St. Edmund, a massive structure of Gothic stone, is the stage for a synod, a formal assembly of the clergy, called to discuss royal interference in church affairs. The air in the vast main nave carries the strong scent of damp stone and the sweet, pungent aroma of incense burning in heavy brass censers. The dominant sound is the deep resonance of ecclesiastical voices and the slow drag of woolen vestments brushing across the stone floor. The temperature is bitterly cold, despite the torches burning along the walls. The focus turns to Bishop Adhemar, an elderly prelate of 70, with a vivid face and a thunderous voice, who leads the debate over Clause 1 of the Magna Carta. That clause, guaranteeing that the English Church shall be free and shall have all her rights whole and her liberties undiminished, was the jewel of the charter for the clergy. Bishop Adhemar uses it as his shield against King Edward's attempts to tax church property to finance his wars. Brother Eluan notes an important social historical curiosity. At the time, the church owned nearly 1/5 of all cultivated land in England. Its wealth made it an irresistible target for debt-ridden kings, and Clause 1 of the Charter was a vital shield. The clergy became one of the first and most persistent groups to demand the Charter's reconfirmation, since it directly protected their property and their spiritual autonomy. The debate in the Synod is intense. Bishop Adhemar argues that while the clergy must be loyal to the king, that loyalty cannot become blind obedience in financial matters. He feels the rough parchment of the Magna Carta in his hands, its weight, the weight of a promise that cannot be broken. The contrast is subtle. Faith calls for obedience to God, but law demands obedience to earthly justice. The bishop recalls a small human story from his youth, King John's pressure to manipulate the election of bishops and the resulting excommunication that plunged the kingdom into spiritual chaos. He understands that the church's freedom is not a luxury, but a necessity, so it can defend the poor and the weak without fear of royal retaliation. His voice, echoing through the nave, becomes a kind of moral thunder. He reminds the assembly that Clause 1 is the foundation of all other liberties. If a king can oppress the church, holder of spiritual power, then he can oppress anyone. The serene conviction in his voice calms the younger prelates who fear the king's anger. Brother Eluan notes an old medieval custom, confirmation charters. Whenever a king needed funds, he often offered to reconfirm the Magna Carta in exchange for taxes. This practice, though cynical, turned the charter into a continual political contract, ensuring it was constantly remembered and renewed. Bishop Adhemar yields the floor to Abbot Giles, a younger and more diplomatic leader. Giles explains how Clause 40, "To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay justice," affected common people who sought refuge and aid in church courts. By guaranteeing the right of free men to justice, the Charter strengthened the Church's mission of charity. Brother Eluan records the faint smell of beeswax from the candles burning without rest, a scent he associates with perseverance and the light of reason in a time of political darkness. Each candle, slowly consumed to give light, becomes a metaphor for the Church's dedication to the cause of law. The reflection widens, connecting the individual and the collective. The Church's fight for Clause 1 was not selfish. By protecting itself, it created a legal precedent that shielded nobles and merchants as well. They, too, could use the Charter to resist royal extortion. The Church became the first and strongest political lobby of the realm. Bishop Adhemar rests his hand on one of the abbey's great stone pillars, feeling the cold, solid texture. The massive architecture, built to last for centuries, is a symbol of the permanence of the law he defends. Law, like stone, must be unbreakable. Brother Eluan closes this first part with the image of the Synod preparing to write a formal response to King Edward I. The sound of monks readying quills and parchment echoes through the nave, slow, deliberate movements made by men who are about to impose the authority of the written word over the will of the king. Brother Eluan continues, still sensing the biting cold inside the Abbey of St. Edmund, where Bishop Adhemar and Abbot Giles defend the freedom of the Church. He now reflects on how the pressure of the clergy touched the lives of ordinary peasants, who sought sanctuary and the protection of canon law against secular tyranny. The scent of cold stone and incense deepens, mingling with the subtle aroma of ancient parchment. Bishop Adhemar addresses the assembly once more, focusing on Clause 39 of the Magna Carta, the right to due legal process, and its connection to the medieval custom of church sanctuary. He explains that although the right of asylum was ancient, the Magna Carta provided a legal foundation for the church to challenge the secular crown whenever the king tried to seize a free man without a lawful judgment of his peers. Civil law, perhaps unintentionally, strengthened the church's hand in defending the weak. Brother Elouan notes a social historical curiosity. Church properties like St. Edmund's Abbey were not just centres of prayer, they were major employers of free peasants and serfs. The monastery's prosperity, protected by Clause 1, freedom of the church, had a cascading effect, shielding the livelihood of hundreds of families who worked its lands, keeping them safe from the king's abusive taxes. Abbot Giles reads aloud a letter from London, describing how Parliament, whose existence and authority were indirectly strengthened by the Charter's requirement that taxes be approved, was using the Magna Carta to force King Edward I into greater fairness. He sits, and the slow rustle of his wool robe against stone is almost a whisper, a quiet counterpoint to the passion in his voice. Bishop Adhemar touches his forehead, feeling the coarse linen of his mitre beneath his fingers. His serenity lies in the certainty that the written word now has more permanence than the crown. King John was forced to seal the charter, King Henry III was forced to reconfirm it, and even the powerful King Edward I is forced to negotiate with it. The poetic metaphor is clear. The charter is an anchor that keeps the ship of state from sinking into tyranny. Brother Elouan reflects on the idea of superior law. The Church's struggle was, at its core, for the belief that there exists a fundamental law, whether divine law or the Magna Carta, that a king cannot change by sheer will. Born out of John's tyranny, this idea became the foundation of English constitutional development. He senses the subtle contrast between the abbey's cold air and the warmth of conviction among the prelates. The cold recalls the brutality of the feudal world and its wars, but the warmth of faith and the written law offers a quiet hope. The incense, sandalwood and myrrh spreads through the nave like a balm for souls troubled by fear of confiscation and injustice. Bishop Adhemar urges his peers to send messengers to the king, not with threats, but with copies of the Magna Carta and reminders of his oaths. His voice, low but firm, carries the weight of a body of laws more than 50 years old, an antiquity that in the Middle Ages gave unquestioned authority. Brother Elouan closes the chapter with the image of Abbot Giles and Bishop Adhemar kneeling in prayer. The shadows of the tall Gothic pillars stretch outward, creating a moment of contemplative pause. Their struggle for law is not only a matter of politics, but also an act of faith and morality. The sound of the abbey bell ringing the Angelus, the evening prayer, is the last echo in the vast hall. Slow, rhythmic, and gentle. Brother Elouan closes his eyes in Belvedere, sensing that this extension into the realm of the Church reveals the Magna Carta to be, above all, a document of political morality. A moment of silence and reflection rises in the middle of so much turbulence, centered on a single object that symbolizes the endurance of law, the goose quill. Brother Elouan, still imagining from distant Belvedere, now places himself in the inner courtyard of Westminster Palace, in London, in the year 1297, the moment when King Edward I solemnly reconfirms the Magna Carta, ensuring its inclusion among the official statutes of the realm. The courtyard of Westminster sits under a tense silence, broken only by the soft whistle of wind weaving between the stone towers, carrying the smell of straw and city grime that always lingered in London, mixed with the scent of fresh parchment. It is the dry cold of late winter. The focus is on Thomas, the young royal scribe, 20 years old, entrusted with preparing the final official copy of the charter for the archives. Thomas works in a small chamber adjacent to the Great Hall, and his only instrument is a large, well-trimmed goose quill. He feels the texture of the quill, light and flexible, yet with a sharp, precise tip. Every stroke of his hand is careful and deliberate, for this parchment must be flawless, a silent testimony to King Edward's supposed seriousness in reconfirming the charter, though in truth he did so only to secure funds for his wars. Brother Eluan notes a gentle cultural observation. In the medieval world, writing held extraordinary power. A document like the Magna Carta, reconfirmed, sealed, and written in Latin, carried an almost sacred reverence. Its very existence gave the agreement a permanence far greater than the spoken promises of kings. The dominant sound in the chamber is the slow, methodical scratch of Thomas's quill across parchment. It is the sound of order in an age of political disorder, the audible representation of law being patiently imposed. Thomas remembers his father, who served as a scribe under Henry III, and the uncertainty that once shadowed the charter. But now it has become statute, a fundamental law. He is copying Clause 9, which in the 1225 version became Clause 13, guaranteeing the liberties and customs of London and other towns, an essential promise to secure the loyalty of the growing middle class. Thomas knows the king does not reconfirm the charter out of goodwill, but out of financial need, yet the result is the same. The law survives. Brother Eluan reflects on the subtle contrast between the silence of the small writing chamber and the distant noise of negotiations in the Great Hall. Edward the Fair, a powerful and war-driven monarch, is being forced to bow to written law to raise money for his campaigns in Scotland and France. The law has become his self-imposed prison, and Thomas's quill is the key that locks it. The smell of warm beeswax, the wax that will become the Great Seal, is strong in the room. Thomas lifts a cone of wax, feeling its cold, pliable surface. He knows that the sealing will be the final gesture, the moment where the scribe's pen meets the king's authority and words become law. The young scribe carries a quiet human memory. The story of an uncle falsely accused of theft in King John's day, who would have died in prison without the family's money, without a lawful judgment of his peers. Thomas feels the moral weight of his quill, knowing that each word he writes is a small promise against tyranny. Brother Eluan captures the poetic image of invitation. The goose quill, such a simple object, has outlasted the bird that once carried it, and will outlast the king who depends on it. The scratching of the quill in Westminster is the sound of persistence. Thomas places the quill in the inkwell, the faint tap of goose feather against ceramic. The copy is finished. He looks at the parchment, its dark lines and perfect script, and a deep serenity settles over him. The law is ready to be sealed and to live. The young royal scribe, Thomas, stands in the quiet chamber at Westminster, inspecting the freshly written parchment of the reconfirmed Magna Carta under the faint light of an oil lamp. Brother Eluan, still picturing it all from distant Belvedere, now deepens his gentle cultural observation, focusing on the object itself, its material reality as both art and law. The texture of the parchment, with its slightly uneven surface, is a reminder of its organic origin and its transformation into a document of eternal authority. Thomas reaches for the cone of beeswax, breathing in its soft, clean scent, a striking contrast to the smell of sweat and ambition drifting from the Great Hall, where King Edward the Fan had been negotiating moments before. He knows beeswax was expensive and used only for the most important seals, unlike the green or brown wax reserved for lesser documents. The purity of the wax mirrors the solemnity of the act about to take place, the confirmation of the law. Brother Eluan notes the medieval custom of public reading. To ensure the charter could not be ignored or denied, the Magna Carta would be read aloud 4 times a year in every cathedral in the kingdom. That repeated sound, clergy chanting the Latin text, then translating it, was how the law slipped into the collective memory. It was justice proclaimed out loud. Thomas looks up as knights and barons enter the chamber. Their velvet cloaks and fur-lined garments sweep across the stone floor. The metallic clink of their spurs is sharp and martial, a subtle contrast to the silent concentration of his work. He understands that the strength of the Magna Carta lies in the unity of these men who, out of self-interest, had accidentally created a law for the common good. He remembers a small story his father once told him about King John's tax collectors seizing horses and supplies without payment. Thomas knows Clause 28, forbidding such seizures without instant compensation, and Clause 39, trial by peers, are the great victories the Charter offers ordinary men. His job is to make sure those protections survive. Brother Eluan reflects that, in 1297, when the Charter was finally added to the official statutes of the realm, it ceased to be a simple agreement between king and barons. It became the fundamental law of England, a source of authority higher than the crown itself. This is the heart of the contemplative pause. A parchment born from rebellion has now gained permanent legal life. Thomas lifts the royal seal, a cold, heavy piece of metal, and sets it above the melted beeswax. The weight he feels is the weight of royal power. Pressing the seal into the warm wax is the gesture that binds the king's will to the written word. The sound is soft and final, a quiet breath, and then silence. Brother Eluan records the historical fact that Edward the Heen attempted to attach a clause, allowing him to bypass the charter in times of war, but the barons resisted and stopped him. The monk sees clearly that the struggle to limit royal power is endless, yet serenity lies in the stubborn insistence of the king's subjects. The law must be obeyed. Thomas steps back from the table. The warm scent of beeswax fills the chamber. He looks at the sealed document, now a true work of legal art, and feels a deep peace, his duty fulfilled. The fear of annulment that haunted his father's generation has begun to fade. Brother Eluan closes the chapter with a poetic image. The goose quill in Westminster and the goldsmith's hammer in Bristol, 2 simple tools, are the true guardians of the Magna Carta. They are the instruments that turn will into action and words into law. The palace bell rings the hour, and its calm echo is the sound of the law, now written into time. Shifting the focus away from the court and the towns, Brother Eluan, still reflecting from distant Belvedere, now turns to the rural world, where the law is felt in a far more direct and tangible way. He imagines himself in the small village of Oakhaven, deep in the countryside of Norfolk, around the year 1315. It is a time of terrible scarcity and hunger, when the law is tested by necessity. Oakhaven carries the heavy silence of the great famine that has spread across Europe. The air smells of cold, wet soil, rotting hay, and the acrid smoke of damp firewood struggling to burn. The sounds are muted, soft, tired voices of villagers speaking only when needed, and the distant croak of frogs in a nearby marsh. The air is brutally cold, a biting chill that sinks straight into the bones. The focus settles on Eloise, a 30-year-old peasant woman with calloused hands and a worn but determined expression. She is doing everything she can to protect her family's small barley harvest from confiscation. The local feudal lord Baron Montfort is under pressure from the king to provide more supplies, and his officials have begun acting arbitrarily. Eloise remembers the stories her father once told about King John and his greedy officers. Brother Elouan notes a curious truth about medieval life. Even a free peasant was bound by heavy local taxes and the will of the Lord. Yet Clause 28 of the Magna Carta, banning the seizure of grain or personal goods without immediate payment, was the only shield Eloise had. She knew that the law, now a formal statute, carried weight. From Eloise's point of view, everything is suspicion and caution. She is afraid, but her need to protect her family forces her to defy the Baron's men. The gesture in focus is her hand hidden beneath her wool apron, gripping a small dagger, her silent, steady symbol of resistance. She walks into the barn, feeling the rough, frozen wood under her fingertips. She plans to hide the last sacks of barley. The subtle contrast is clear. The fragility of peasant life on one side, the hard certainty of written law on the other. To Eloise, the law is not an abstract idea, but a distant promise that even kings and their servants are bound by rules. She remembers a small story her father told. During a famine under King John, their family lost their 2 best sheep to royal officers. Her father, a quiet and respectful man, could do nothing. Now Eloise has something he never had. The legal words of the Magna Carta, spoken aloud in church by the village priest. She repeats them to herself. Justice for the free man. Brother Elouan records the importance of Clause 20, which stated that a free man could not be fined to the point of losing his livelihood. In times of war or famine, that single promise was the difference between survival and ruin. The wind howls against the barn, and the old wooden door groans in the cold. Danger feels close. Eloise works quickly and silently, guided by urgency. She can smell the dry barley, a precious scent in days of hunger. Brother Elouan reflects that Eloise's perspective reveals the true resilience of the Magna Carta. The document did not survive only in the archives of Westminster, but in the memories and determination of peasants who used it as a moral weapon against local oppression. When she finishes hiding the grain, Eloise sits for a moment, breathing hard. Fear is still there, but the act gives her a small sense of control. The faint smell of hay and barley brings her the only comfort she can afford. Brother Elouan closes this first part with the image of Eloise stepping out of the barn, her eyes fixed on the muddy road, waiting for the arrival of the officials, armed with nothing but her determination and the faint memory of an old, powerful law. Eloise stays alert. The smell of wet earth and someone else's fireplace smoke hangs in the cold air of Oakhaven. Brother Elouan, deep in his reflection, follows this new perspective on the law, watching how fear and hope take turns in rural life. The wind no longer howls, it sighs, tired and low. Eloise feels the rough wool of her apron beneath her fingers, a reminder of her humble place in the world and of her stubborn resolve. Brother Elouan notes a curious legal custom. In the Middle Ages, a free peasant, a freeholder, did possess rights to his land. Those rights were not as strong as a baron's, but they were recognized in the king's courts. The Magna Carta gave the legal foundation for defending a free man's property, Clause 28, something unimaginable under King John, when arbitrary confiscation was the rule, not the exception. Eloise sees the silhouettes of 2 riders approaching along the muddy road, Baron Montfort's officers, and her heart races. The sound of hooves sinking into the wet soil is the sound of danger drawing near. She remembers the promise her father made before he died, that the great law, Magna Carta, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, would protect the weak. Believing in that law is the only armor she owns. The leader of the officers, a heavy, rough-looking man named Rodolphe, dismounts in front of her home. He demands the rest of the barley harvest in the Baron's name. Eloise, speaking with steady courage, repeats the words she heard in church. She invokes the law that forbids a royal or feudal officer from seizing her goods without immediate payment. The subtle contrast lies between the knight's physical strength and the woman's moral force. Brother Elouan reflects on a brief parallel. Eloise's struggle is an echo of the barons at Runnymede, but unlike them, the peasant woman has no army. Her only weapon is the written word. And the knight's fear of breaking a confirmed public royal law gives her real power. Rodolphe hesitates. The air smells of sweat and sour ale around him, but that is not what freezes his hand. It is memory. Officers who violated the Charter's liberties could lose their own positions or property, a dangerous price in times of famine. The written law was feared by the powerful because punishment struck high as well as low. Héloïse rests her hand on the wooden doorframe, feeling the cold grain of the timber. She does not look away. The knight, faced with her silent determination and with the invisible threat of the law, steps back. He knows that taking this matter to Baron Montfort's court could reveal his own greed and incompetence. Brother Elouan notes that Clause 20, which forbade fines that would ruin a man, was often used by judges to protect peasants. The kingdom needed its farmers alive. Dead or destitute peasants paid no taxes. The law was not only just, it was practical. Rodolphe curses under his breath and mounts his horse. The thud of hooves and the sharp order to depart are his quiet admission of defeat. Héloïse watches the riders disappear down the road, and her shoulders slowly loosen. Serenity arrives in a single, gentle breath. Brother Elouan closes the scene with a simple truth. The real power of the Magna Carta lived in the fact that it was retold, translated, and feared. Even in the smallest corners of the realm, protecting the bread of Héloïse's family from hunger and oppression. Shifting the focus from the countryside to the halls of justice, the scene returns to the architecture, sounds, and smells of a courtroom, the place where the Magna Carta was truly put to use. Brother Elouan, reflecting from his quiet corner in Belvedere, imagines himself in the courtyard of the Palace of Justice at Westminster in London in the year 1330, a time of relative peace and steady legal development. The courtyard is alive with organized bustle. The air smells of burning turf, fresh parchment, and the sharp sting of vinegar used for cleaning and disinfecting. Subtle sounds fill the space, the distant echo of judges' gavels inside the hearing rooms, and the constant murmur of lawyers, petitioners, and curious townsfolk waiting for their cases to be called. A damp, chilly breeze settles against the stone walls. The familiar feel of London's great public buildings. The focus shifts to Hugo, a young lawyer in his 20s, dressed in a plain black linen robe and a woolen cloak. He is preparing to defend a client whose land has been seized. Hugo lives by Clause 39 of the Magna Carta, due process of law, and Clause 40, justice shall not be sold, denied, or delayed. He runs his fingers over the rough parchment containing his notes, the document that is both his tool and his weapon. Brother Elouan notes a curious medieval custom. Lawyers often wore colorful, elaborate robes to signal not just status, but the kind of law they practiced, canon law or common law. Hugo's plain clothing reflects his loyalty to the common law and to the Magna Carta, the foundation of his arguments. Their robes were a kind of silent language in court. Hugo remembers his mentor, who once told him that the greatness of the Magna Carta lay not merely in its promises, but in the procedure it protected. No matter how guilty a man might seem, the trial had to follow the law of the land and be decided by the lawful judgment of his peers. Form was freedom. This devotion to procedure was born from the chaos of King John's arbitrary justice. The sensory richness of the courtroom grows. Hugo watches the court officer pull the heavy oak door shut, a quiet gesture that seals the outside world away and signals the start of formal justice. The deep thud of the wood meeting stone is a solemn announcement. The law now speaks. Brother Eluan adds a note on medieval courthouse architecture. High ceilings and narrow windows were designed to intimidate, but also to let daylight fall directly on the posted copies of the Magna Carta, a symbolic promise of transparency, even if reality did not always match the ideal. Hugo feels the subtle contrast between the nobleman entering with silk-lined cloaks and his client, a simple farmer who lost everything. In this room, the Magna Carta is the only equalizer. Hugo's voice, clear and disciplined, is the farmer's only shield against power. He prepares the story he will use in court, a tale of a nobleman in the time of Henry III who tried to seize lands under false accusations, and how a judge, terrified of violating Clause 39, stopped him. The fear of breaking a royal statute carried more weight than any noble family's threats. Brother Eluan reflects that for the people of London, Clause 17, fixing the Court of Common Pleas permanently at Westminster, was the Magna Carta's greatest gift. Justice no longer followed the king from place to place. It had a home. It was predictable. For the first time, the law lived in a building, not in a monarch's whim. Hugo takes a sip of sour wine from a pewter cup, feeling the cold metal and the sharp taste. It clears his throat. He needs his voice to be steady, firm enough to match the law he relies on. Brother Eluan closes the scene with the image of Hugo stepping into the courtroom, parchment tucked tightly beneath his arm. The sound of his footsteps is steady and confident, the quiet echo of trust in the law, the truest legacy of a tyrant king. Young Hugo now stands inside the Palace of Justice at Westminster. Brother Eluan, reflecting quietly from Belvedere, lets his senses expand to describe the courtroom, this place where the law, born from rebellion against King John, still struggles to stay alive. The judge's voice echoes against the high stone walls, a heavy sound of authority. The air carries the warm scent of beeswax candles, mixed with the strong, sour smell of urine, common in medieval public buildings. Brother Eluan notes a curious medieval custom. Even decades after the Magna Carta, kings tried to bend justice to their will. King Edward III, ruling in 1330, often attempted to sidestep the Charter's protections. Yet the judges feared something greater than the king's displeasure, the threat of being dismissed or worse, sparking a revolt from barons who still watched the crown with suspicion. The threat of rebellion, born at Runnymede, was the real shield of the law. Hugo turns to the jury, 12 free men, his client's peers. He feels the rough, cold wood of the advocate's pulpit beneath his hands and anchors himself in Clause 39. He argues that the confiscation of his client's land happened without the lawful judgment of his peers, and therefore it is unlawful, no matter who ordered it. His voice is clear and direct, stripped of legal jargon. He speaks to common sense. The courtroom deepens in sensory richness. Pale daylight slips through the tall lancet windows, catching the fine dust floating in the air. The tiny particles shimmer in and out of view. It is a poetic image. Truth, like dust, only becomes visible when the light of the law shines on it. Brother Eluan reflects on the small human story at the heart of the case. The farmer, simple and frightened, had arrived trembling. Yet now, hearing Clause 39 spoken aloud in his defense, something new appears on his face. Hope. Hugo becomes his champion, and the law becomes his sword. The contrast between the farmer's humility and the majesty of the law is quiet but powerful. Eluan adds a historical note. The jury system, though older than the Magna Carta, was strengthened by it, becoming a cornerstone of the law of the land. The document helped end the old trials by ordeal. No more boiling water, no more red-hot iron, replacing arbitrary suffering with reasoned judgment. Hugo gestures to the copy of the Magna Carta hanging on the courtroom wall. a curious custom meant to remind everyone, including the judge, of the law that stood above all men. He holds a parchment copy in his hands, but he invokes the one on the wall, the state's copy, the unchanging law King John was forced to accept. Brother Eluan ends the scene with the sound of the judge instructing the jury to retire and deliberate. The heavy oak doors close behind them with a deep, quiet thud, a sound of calm expectation. The law has been spoken. Justice now rests in the hands of the farmers' peers. In Belvedere, Brother Eluan smiles. The struggle between King John and his barons 2 generations earlier is still protecting a simple farmer from Norfolk. He closes his eyes, breathing in the faint scent of peat smoke, and the image of Hugo standing before the jury becomes his serenity. Reflecting on how people saw royal power change, from King John the Tyrant to the rule of written law, Brother Eluan, still deep in his quiet meditation in Belvedere, now imagines himself at the royal court in Windsor in the year 1362, the height of King Edward III's reign. The Magna Carta is treated as a sacred relic, though one constantly challenged. Windsor is breathtaking in its luxury. The air carries the sweet scent of fine beeswax, exotic spices, and the soft smoke of indoor hearths. The dominant sound is the polite murmur of courtiers and the delicate clinking of silver cutlery during a royal feast. The warmth of the great hall creates a carefully crafted comfort, a stark contrast to the cold in rural villages, highlighting the distance between power and the people. The focus settles on Lady Alienor, a noble woman in her 50s, elegant, sharp-minded, and widowed. Her late husband was one of the barons who helped secure the Magna Carta's reconfirmation years ago. She sees herself as a quiet guardian of tradition and law. From her place at the feast, she observes King Edward III, a charismatic and beloved monarch who, paradoxically, is trying to levy new taxes without the consent of Parliament, slipping around the very spirit of the Magna Carta. Brother Eluan notes a curious fact. King Edward III was forced to confirm the Magna Carta no fewer than 15 times during his long reign. He did it mostly to raise money for the 100 Years' War. Yet that repetition, year after year, kept the Charter alive, turning it from a crisis document into a regular political weapon. Lady Alienor feels the soft velvet of her gown and the weight of a small silver medallion inscribed with a motto about justice. She remembers stories from her husband's father, a man who fought against King John. For her, the battle never ended, it simply changed shape. The tyrant is no longer a man, but the crown's boundless ambition. Light slowly changes in the great hall. As the sun sets, torches and iron chandeliers are lit, casting long, theatrical shadows. The dim glow becomes a poetic metaphor. King Edward III is trying to blur the bright clarity of the law with charm, popularity, and clever taxation schemes. Brother Eluan recalls another medieval custom, the king's letters of grace, which pardoned crimes in exchange for payment. Edward III used them often, undermining the due process promised by Clause 39. Lady Alienor whispers to another noblewoman about the injustice of it, a faint ripple of unease moving quietly through the court. She remembers a small lesson from her late husband. Clause 29. To no one will we sell, deny, or delay justice, was the most vital of all. It ensured access to the courts regardless of wealth or rank. She realizes the greatest threat is not brute force, but the soft corruption of the law. Lutes and flutes play gently in the background, pleasant and refined. To Lady Alienor, the music feels hollow, pretty distractions masking a silence in the rule of law. She gives a quiet, disapproving glance to her allies, her unspoken protest. Brother Eluan notes that in 1354, Parliament translated Clause 39 into English for the first time, using the phrase, due process of law. It was a soft but powerful reinforcement, a reminder the charter belonged to everyone, not just scholars and nobles. Lady Alienor smiles politely at the king, her expression masking her thoughts. No matter how powerful he seems, he still needs the law, and the law is written on a sealed parchment, the lingering shadow of King John, the tyrant who taught England the price of oppression. Lady Alienor, radiant but calm, stands as a symbol of quiet resistance. She proves that the fight for the Magna Carta has become a battle of patience and intellect, not of swords. Lady Alienor remains in her quiet vigil at the court of Windsor. In his distant reflection in Belvedere, Brother Elouan senses a slow shift in the emotional climate. The court's show of loyalty to King Edward III hides a deeper, disciplined watchfulness from nobles and clergy alike, people who learned under King John never to trust absolute power. The aroma of candied fruits and spiced wine floating through the hall is the scent of the luxury the king hopes to fund with taxes no one has approved. Brother Elouan notes a gentle reinforcement of ideas through repetition. He writes that the king's repeated need to reconfirm the Magna Carta, something Edward III was forced to do many times, became a political habit that ensured the document never faded from memory. Each renewed oath was a quiet lesson in constitutional thinking, teaching the kingdom that the limits of royal power were not a request, but a tradition. Lady Alienor approaches a young knight, Sir Gareth, and tells him the story of Clause 14, removed in later versions, though its principle survived. It once required the king to summon the Common Council, the future Parliament, before approving new taxes. She explains that King John treated the royal treasury like his own purse, and that this clause was the first attempt to separate the king's money from the nation's money. Sir Gareth listens intently, feeling the cold metal of his sword hilt, the symbol of his honor. He senses the subtle contrast. A sword protects the kingdom, but the law, the parchment, protects the kingdom from its own sword. The Charter, born in defiance of King John, has become the moral compass of the realm. Brother Elouan records a small historical curiosity about Parliament, from the French parlour to speak. Parliament, once merely a council of nobles, gained real power because the Magna Carta established that the king could not impose taxes without its consent. King John, unintentionally, became the father of representative government. Lady Alienor walks toward a window in the great hall, brushing her fingers across the opaque glass, a novelty of the era, and looks out into the gathering darkness. She thinks of Clause 39 and Clause 40, due process, and the promise not to sell, delay, or deny justice. These were the protections that allowed a craftsman or a merchant to stand up against the king's officers. The law wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Brother Elouan reflects on the king's charming smile as he greets the courtiers. The smile is warm, but the faint chill creeping in from outside is a reminder that the threat of abuse always lingers, just like winter. Serenity lives only in constant vigilance, carried quietly by Lady Alienor and her allies. The sound of trumpets announcing the end of the feast rings through the hall, a sound of royal grandeur. To Lady Alienor it feels hollow. She bids farewell to Sir Gareth, feeling a gentle peace. She has planted a seed, the memory of King John and the power of parchment, in the young knight's mind. Her slow work continues. Brother Elouan ends the chapter with a thought. The Magna Carta became a force of nature. Kings dam it, bend it, ignore it. But the river of law always finds a way to flow, forcing power to bow. He closes his eyes, breathing in the scent of peat smoke from his own hearth, and the image of Lady Alienor in Windsor becomes his quiet metaphor for silent resistance. Brother Elouan, still deep in his distant meditation in Belvedere, now imagines himself inside a record office in York in the year 1450, on the eve of the Wars of the Roses, an age in which the law had become a vital political weapon. The record office is somber and serious. The air carries the dry scent of old dust, sealing wax and cleaning vinegar. The main sound is the slow, steady creak of the archivist's footsteps across the wooden boards, a sound of permanence in a time of political instability. The cold in the room is subtle but constant, like the weight of history pressing gently against every surface. The focus turns to Rowan, the chief archivist, a thin man in his 60s with ink-stained hands and a remarkable memory. He is sorting through the royal statutes. In his gloved hands lies the official 1225 copy of the Magna Carta, reconfirmed by generations of kings. To him, the parchment is less a legal document and more a sacred relic of law itself. Brother Elouan notes a historical curiosity. By this period, the Magna Carta had become so revered that Parliament often invoked it as a weapon to limit royal power, whether or not the original text said exactly what politicians claimed. Its symbolic power had grown beyond its literal meaning. It had become the founding myth of limited government. Rowan feels the brittle, fragile surface of the ancient parchment beneath his linen gloves. He remembers a story his grandfather, once a knight, used to tell about the tyranny of King John. The memory of arbitrary confiscation and denied justice is what gives the charter its weight. The law is, in many ways, the memory of disaster. The gesture in focus. Rowan unrolls the Magna Carta with a slow, almost ritualistic calm. He is checking the text for a new parliament, preparing to demand its reconfirmation during a tense struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster. In chaos, the law becomes a fulcrum. Brother Elouan writes about recalling past elements. The archivist knows that the most quoted clause is Clause 39, the guarantee of due process, which has become synonymous with English liberty and the most powerful tool of lawyers and Parliament against abuse. The faint flutter of parchment in the air sounds like justice being summoned. Rowan lingers over Clause 1, freedom of the Church. Though it began as a political deal between John and the clergy, it eventually became the wedge that opened the door for everyone else's freedoms. The subtle irony, the self-interest of one group led to benefits for all. Brother Elouan records one final historical detail. The Magna Carta directly influenced the Statute of Westminster of 1275, which formalized Parliament's legislative power. King John's document, born in rebellion, became the foundation for the very institution that would permanently limit the crown. Rowan inhales the soft, sweet scent of a small bundle of lavender he keeps near the shelves to deter insects. The fragrance is a quiet comfort and a gentle hope that the law, like the flower, will survive the winter of war and instability. The chapter ends with Rowan closing the heavy oak chest where the Magna Carta rests. The law is safe, silent for now, but ready to be called upon. The archivist Rowan remains in the chamber in York, and Brother Elouan, still reflecting from distant Belvedere, observes the solemnity of his act of protecting the law. He deepens this quiet preparation for the ending, contemplating how the Magna Carta had become a beacon of legality on the edge of civil war. The strong scent of dust and ancient parchment is the smell of accumulated history. Brother Elouan records a gentle recalling of past elements through the archivist's eyes. Rowan turns through an old register and remembers King John's attempts to force nobles into unwanted marriages and seize inheritances. Clause 8 of the Magna Carta, protecting widows from forced marriage, and Clause 3, limiting inheritance taxes, were, at the time, concrete victories against John's personal tyranny. Rowan's gesture is one of extreme care. He uses a camel hair brush to sweep dust from the parchment surface, feeling the delicate texture beneath his hand. He treats the Magna Carta not simply as a statute, but as the physical testimony of the kingdom's struggle against absolute power, a document ironically born from the height of tyranny. Brother Elouan notes a historical curiosity about the political use of the Magna Carta in the 15th century. Leaders on both sides of the Wars of the Roses, Lancaster and York, swore loyalty to the Carta, each claiming to defend the ancient liberties against the other's supposed tyranny. Even in a time of anarchy, the document's moral authority remained unquestioned. Rowan lingers over the original Clause 14, the requirement of consent for taxation. Though kings often ignored it, the principle survived as the very foundation of Parliament. The king's money is the people's money, and it must be approved. This was the greatest seed of liberty left behind by John's disastrous reign. The mood of quiet retreat is reinforced by the sound of wind howling against the thick stone walls, a reminder of the approaching chaos of war. Brother Elouan reflects that even if the kingdom collapses into civil conflict, the written law will remain intact, waiting to be lifted again when peace returns. Rowan places a small lead weight on the unrolled parchment, a gesture symbolizing the solidity and permanence of law in a world of uncertainty. The subtle contrast lies between the physical weight of the lead and the moral weight of the document it guards. Brother Elouan in Belvedere closes his eyes, an expectant calm toward the ending. He breathes in the scent of lavender and wax, and the image of Rowan blends with the memory of Athelstan, the old scribe, the persistence of the guardians of law. The story of King John is almost finished, yet his legacy of resistance is safe. Brother Elouan, in his final reflection in Belvedere, returns to the present of his own chamber, still the 13th century, but now with the weight of future centuries resting in his mind, focusing on the ultimate legacy of King John Lackland. The atmosphere in his chamber is deeply still. The scent of peat smoke is the only aroma that lingers, mingling with the faint freshness of an approaching dawn. The only sound is the heavy silence of Belvedere as it sleeps, broken now and then by the slow, steady beat of his own heart. The night's chill is beginning to fade, announcing the end of both the darkness and the tale. His thoughts gather into a final poetic farewell. The Magna Carta, forced upon the tyrant John in 1215, is not merely a document. It is an underground river of law flowing beneath history, always resurfacing to nourish freedom. King John is no longer a figure of hatred, but an instrument of providence whose cruelty produced good. Brother Elouan picks up his quill, feeling the familiar texture of the wooden handle, and turns to a quiet reflection between past and present. He thinks of Athelstan, the scribe in London, of William, the wool merchant in Rye, of Heloise, the peasant woman in Oakhaven. Lives separated by decades and by social classes, all protected because stubborn barons stood against a single cruel king. He returns to his earliest images in a gentle and unspoken way, remembering the silent sadness of the peasants in his own village. He knows the Magna Carta is a promise that even they, living under the weight of feudal rule, may one day see their rights defended by a law higher than the local lord or the king. The idea that no free man shall be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers is the most enduring of all. Brother Elouan writes that the true legacy of King John is not his military defeat or the loss of his lands in France, but his humiliation, being forced to seal the document. This act of surrender became, ironically, the founding moment of constitutional law. The final climax of this history is the acceptance of that irony. He feels the subtle contrast between the weakness of the royal wax seal, which the king tried so many times to break, and the unbreakable strength of the idea inside it. The seal, meant to represent Jon's absolute power, became the symbol of his limits. In the end, the law proved to be the true sovereign of the realm. Brother Eloan turns directly to the listener. Picture the parchment at Runnymede, damp and freshly sealed, lying in the middle of the meadow. It is more than a document. It is a silent promise that oppression does not last forever. Even from the most tyrannical of kings, the greatest lessons of hope can be born. The scent of peat's smoke becomes now a scent of peace, of home, of rest. Brother Eloan closes the manuscript, and the dry sound of leather striking the table is the final sound of the story. The circle is complete. Brother Eloan feels the comforting presence of peace settling over the last lines of his chronicle. In his chamber at Belvedere, time seems to move with a sacred slowness, and he focuses on the message of peace that King Jon's tyranny has left for future ages. The air, once cold and damp, is now light and full of promise. He gently returns to the first images without naming them, the sharp freshness of the night air at the beginning of the tale, and the smell of bread in the village, the scent of the life that the law sought to protect. The touch of his woolen habit against his skin reminds him of the simplicity of his own existence, made safer by the parchment he has recorded. Brother Eloan reflects, the Magna Carta is not the story of a hero, but of a villain who, by going too far in his cruelty, taught everyone the value of restraint. Freedom, justice, and the right to a fair judgment, due process, are not gifts. They are hard-won victories, forged in the fire of Jon's oppression. He turns to the listener with poetic farewells. Time, traveler, is like a river, and the Magna Carta is one of its purest springs. King Jon, the tyrant, is only the mist that hovered for a moment, but the spring of law continued to flow, growing stronger with each generation that demanded the agreement be honored. From outside, the song of a nightingale rises, a clear melodic note announcing dawn. It is the sound of renewed hope, the music of justice returning again and again. Brother Eloan accepts the beautiful contrast between the violence of history and the serenity of nature. He closes his inkwell and tidies his writing table. Order restored in his chamber reflects the order that the Magna Carta sought to bring to the kingdom. It is a sensation of peace, the peace that comes when the written word has triumphed over the royal sword. Brother Eloan smiles softly, a smile of deep serenity. He knows that the reign of King Jon, for the historian, is a turning point. It taught the West that power, to be legitimate, must be bound by law. King Jon is the shadow that gave shape to the light of liberty. The scent of morning dew drifts through the window, earth and fresh air mingling with wool and parchment. Brother Eloan rises, his task complete. The story of Jon and the Magna Carta comes to an end, a cycle of oppression and redemption. Until tomorrow, traveler, I'll be waiting to journey with you again through these forgotten ages. You already know where to find me, right here, between history and dreaming. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and sleep well, traveler.